In this video, we're going to take a look at creating a simple and easy line and wash image of a wonderful little bird. Hello there everyone, Matt here with thevirtualinstructor.com, and in this video I'm going to walk you through the process of creating a simple and easy line and wash image of a bird. Now, if you're brand new to line and wash, or you're brand new to pen and ink, or even watercolor, this lesson is for you. So this lesson is designed for beginners, but if you're not a beginner, if you're an intermediate or an advanced artist, you can of course work alongside and embellish your image, of course. Now, what is line and wash? Line and wash usually refers to the combination of a linear medium like pen and ink and a looser fluid medium like watercolor. And that's what we're going to be using for this demonstration. We're going to be combining pen and ink applications with watercolor applications. Now, pen and ink, as you probably know, is a very rigid and detail-oriented medium. It doesn't have to be used in that way, but a lot of times it is. Pen and ink, of course, is very linear. We use line when we create a pen and ink drawing, where watercolor is almost the exact opposite. Watercolor is very fluid. It's not linear-based, and that could be seen as a weakness, and it could be seen as a weakness for pen and ink that it's not fluid. So both of these mediums, of course, have weaknesses and strengths. The strength of pen and ink is that it is rigid and it can be used to define details and also the edges of things. It can also be used to develop textures and other things that might be a little bit more difficult to develop with a watercolor painting, where watercolor is fluid. It is able to create smooth transitions of value and tone and color, and obviously we can't do that with pen and ink. So basically, when we work with a line and wash image, we're using the strengths of each one of these mediums. When we're combining these mediums, we're using the strengths and making up for the weaknesses of the other. So it's a match made in heaven, basically, combining pen and ink and watercolor, and that's what we're going to be doing here. So let's quickly take a look at the materials and we'll dive into the process. So we'll start here with the surface. I'm going to be working on Arches cold press watercolor paper. This is a 140-pound watercolor paper. And because it is cold press, it does have a relatively rough or coarse texture, which means that it gives a little bit more of the advantage to the watercolor applications. If you don't like that rough and textured surface and you're wanting your pen and ink drawing to be a little bit more dominant in the final image, then you might consider working on hot press watercolor paper instead of cold pressed watercolor paper. Now I'm going to be drawing things out relatively lightly here using a lead holder. This is by Staedtler, and I'm going to be using 2H graphite to create the drawing. You want to make sure that the graphite that you use is relatively light so it doesn't dominate the final image. Now, I'll be applying the ink using a nib pen, which is also referred to as a dip pen a lot of times, and that's because you dip the pen into ink to apply it to the surface. Now, these pens get a bad rap because sometimes they splatter, and they're cumbersome to use because you have to keep dipping them into the ink, but they really produce a very nice organic mark, and whenever I can, I would prefer to use a dip pen or a nib pen over the top of a technical drawing pen. Of course, you're free to use any type of technical drawing pen or even a nib pen if you wish. Just make sure that the ink that you're using is waterproof, because when you apply the watercolor over the top, if your ink is not waterproof, then the ink is going to smear around. I like to use Liquitex ink here. This is an acrylic-based ink, so it dries relatively quickly. Now, you want to make sure that the ink you use is dark enough or black enough to create the necessary contrast. And I always like to think that blacker is better when it comes to ink with a pen and ink drawing. So I always look for carbon black on the label when I purchase an ink. The Liquitex ink here has been my favorite for quite a while, but you can also use Speedball Super Black ink. This is going to be nice and dark as well. Now, you can find both of these inks at your local art store and also online. Now, of course, these nibs, of course, are interchangeable. I typically like using these larger nibs, which actually produce a very nice fine point. But if you do decide to go the route of using the nib pens, you can pick up a set. This set was made by Speedball. It's a sketching set by Speedball. It's very inexpensive. And of course, each one of these nibs produces a slightly different mark. You might experiment a little bit before you create your drawing to find out which nib works best for you. As far as brushes go, I'll be using the Grumbacher Golden Edge line of brushes here, and I always like to use round brushes for the most part when I'm using watercolor paint here. And I'll just be using a variety of sizes, a 6 and a 0. I have a 14 brush out here, but I don't use this during the process. But these are Grumbacher Golden Edge brushes. They are nylon brushes, but they're wonderful brushes for watercolor painting. They stay nice and stiff so that you can get some of the details, but they're also nice and soft as well. So you kind of have the best of both worlds with these brushes. As far as the paint goes, I'll be using my Cotman watercolor set by Winsor & Newton. This is considered a student grade line of watercolor paint, but it does still produce professional quality results. I'm really impressed with the Cotman line of watercolor. I do have some of their professional line of watercolors with just a little bit more of a limited palette, but I find myself using the Cotman watercolors a lot because the quality is relatively high. Now you can pick these up at your local art store or also online. We'll begin by sketching out our bird here on 140-pound cold-pressed watercolor paper. I'm using a Staedtler lead holder, which has 2H graphite inside of it. Now, of course, we want to keep our graphite sketch relatively light, and in these early stages, you'll see that the initial sketch is pretty loose as well, and I'll refine it as I go through the process. At this point, I'm just trying to concentrate on the overall shape of the bird. So you can see I've created a shape that encompasses the head and the bulk of the body of the bird, and then I'm going to go ahead and bring down a shape for the tail. Now, of course, once we've got the overall shape, excluding the bill at this point, we can go ahead and start refining things. You can see here I'm cutting out some additional shapes within the broader overall shape here, just making a few little smaller feathers, and then also the shape for the eye. So we're going to continue to add a little bit more to this drawing, but as you can see, we started with larger, broader, more simple shapes, and then we're going to be working to more complex shapes. A lot of times folks will try to draw their subject just using contour lines, which are outlines, when sometimes it's better just to concentrate on the shapes first and then concentrate on the contour lines. We'll go ahead and draw an indication of the branch that the bird is sitting on. And on the right side of the bird, of course, the branch goes away from the viewer. So the body of the bird is covering up some of the branch. But on the left side of the branch overlaps the bird because the branch is coming towards the viewer. And you can see here I'm drawing the shape of the branch right over the top of our sketch of the bird. And that's okay. We can always go back and erase those lines in between the top of the branch and the bottom of the branch. Now you can see I'm working back into the body of the bird, adding a few more additional details. And you can see also that this drawing is still relatively loose and sketchy. Keep in mind that when we go with the pen and ink applications, we're going to refine the drawing quite a bit. Now that our graphite drawing is in place, we're ready to start with the pen and ink applications. And as I mentioned, I'll be using a dip or a nib pen to apply the ink to the surface. Now, when you dip your nib pen into the ink, you want to make sure that you don't dip it too far so that you don't fill up the reservoir too much with ink. There's a little hole in the nib itself, and that's called a breather hole. And you want to make sure that there's at least the ability for the pen to breathe so that the ink can be transferred to the surface. What I like to do is dip the pen into the container of ink and then just lightly let some of that ink roll back off the edge of the container. Then I also like to use the pen to make a few test marks on a test sheet of paper before I go to the final surface. All right, we're ready to start with the pen and ink applications, and you can see I'm drawing right over the top of our graphite drawing in place. And I'm using a nib pen, as I mentioned before. You're welcome to use any type of ink pen that you wish, just as long as it's waterproof, so that your ink doesn't get spread around when you start with the watercolor applications, of course. The ink I'm using for this is actually acrylic-based ink, which dries relatively quickly, and of course it's waterproof when it's completely dry. You can see here that I've started with the eye of the bird since it is a focal point within a focal point. Basically, we're drawn to the eyes of any living organism. So obviously we're going to be drawn to the eye, and I always like to start in the focal point if I can when I'm creating a drawing like this. Now, of course, around the eye we have the top of the head, and I'm defining the edge, the top edge of the head here with some looser strokes, of course, to create that illusion of a furry head. Of course, I know these are small feathers, but it does have a furry appearance. And I'm also gradually darkening up the area just to the right of the eye and also within the eye, but leaving an area for highlight inside of the eye as well. And then moving on to the bill, you can see I'm adding a bit of shadow underneath using directional hatching strokes. And then we'll just continue working our way out from the head here, basically defining each section of the bird with contour lines and then going in and adding a hint of texture here and there with directional strokes. Here you can see we're continuing to work down into the main wings of the bird here. Again, just continuing that process of using directional stroking. Again, I'll point out that the outer contour of the body of the bird does consist of some sketchier marks, so we don't have a clearly defined line. Instead, we have a collection of short hatch marks to define the outer contours. Now, in the areas where we see shadow, of course, we're going to concentrate the marks a little bit more to just give that hint of shadow in our drawing as well. Now you may notice as I work down to the smaller sections within the wing that the sections I'm creating here are not exactly the same as what we see in the reference. They're similar but not exactly the same. And this is perfectly okay, of course. We are creating a piece of art that's different from the photo reference, and we can deviate from that, of course, as long as we're creating a pattern or a texture that's similar to what's represented in the photo reference. Now, one thing I should mention here, if you do use a dip pen or a nib pen, be sure that you're pulling strokes instead of pushing strokes. If you push the stroke with this type of pen, if there's a good amount of ink in the reservoir, it might cause a splatter on your drawing, which is something that you don't want to happen, obviously. So as long as you're pulling your strokes, for the most part, you don't have to really worry about that. The pens do sometimes bleed a little bit, but as long as you don't have too much ink within the reservoir, you shouldn't have any issue there. You'll notice I'm starting to add a bit of shading here and there underneath some of the smaller sections of the wing and also underneath some of the wings itself and along the bottom part of the body. And I'm doing so with hatching. And I'm doing the same thing here on the tree branch. After I've defined the contour lines here, I'm going back and adding a bit of shadow primarily on the bottom side of the branch since our light source is originating from above. Now I'm making directional strokes that flow along in the same direction as the branch itself, and then I'm creating some diagonal strokes that cross over these lines to create darker values or darker shadows in these locations. Be sure to take your time and work slowly when you're creating your pen and ink drawing. There's never a need to rush through this process. And also be sure that you don't overwork your pen and ink drawing. Remember, you're going to be adding watercolor washes, and these watercolor washes are going to affect the value or the darkness or lightness of your final image. So you want to make sure your pen and ink drawing is not a complete pen and ink drawing, but rather it has enough information for us to add watercolor washes over the top without becoming too dark or overworked. Right, now that our pen and ink drawing is in place, we're ready to start adding the color with watercolor. Now we'll start here with a bit of sap green. I'm just going to take some of the sap green with a little bit of water and pull it over to another location on my palette here. And then I'm going to grab a little bit of cadmium yellow too to create a little bit more of a yellow green here, which is a little bit closer to the color that we see on the bird. And then we'll go ahead with a pretty light wash on the top of the head of the bird here. And I'm just going to move the paint around a little bit with the brush. And then while this area is still wet, I've added just a touch of ultramarine to our yellow-green mixture, and I'm going to add this slightly cooler and slightly darker green right underneath the bottom part of that section. Now we'll go ahead and grab a little bit of cadmium red here and pull it over to our palette. And we'll also add a little bit of cadmium orange to that mixture too to make more of a red orange. And then a little bit of our cadmium yellow as well. And that creates a nice, more natural looking orange here. And we're going to go ahead and work on the next section. And I'm going to overlap that green section just a little bit. We're going to encourage a little bit of bleeding there from the top section to the next section down, just a slight bit of bleeding. Then we'll go back and add a little bit of cadmium red while that area is still wet and allow it to bleed around a little bit. Now we're going to adjust this color as we work to the front side of the bird or the breast of the bird. You can see I've added a little bit of darker brown. This is burnt umber in the mixture of our oranges and reds that we just put together. And we're going to allow that darker brown, that burnt umber, to dominate a little bit more as we go to the lower part of the body where we're seeing some more shadows. And of course, if we get a little too carried away with our application, we can always lift things up a little bit with a paper towel, and we can also create highlights that way as well. Now we're going to go back and intensify the color a little bit, mainly at the top part of this section, with a little bit more of our intense orange that we created that's dominated a little bit more by the cadmium red, and we'll also intensify that green section as well with another application. The surface is still damp in this location. It's not totally saturated, but still a little bit damp, so we're going to see a little bit of bleeding, which is what we want to happen. Now I'm going to go ahead and take a little bit of water and a little bit of paint and overlap the next section. We want to create somewhat of a smoother transition between those oranges and also those greens. We'll add a little bit more of the cadmium yellow to our yellow-green mixture there, and with a relatively light application, we'll go ahead and fill in our next section, working our way down over the wings. And of course, with watercolor paints, we want to start with lighter applications and then progressively get darker with our applications. Now, this means that sometimes we have to wait for each layer of paint to dry completely before we go back over the top. If you don't wait for some layers to dry, some mixing may occur that you don't want to happen, and sometimes this is what leads to a muddy appearance in a watercolor painting. Now, of course, there are times when we want to encourage the colors to bleed and run into each other, and that's when we're going to apply the paint when the surface is still wet. As you can see here, the surface is damp, and as I'm adding some of these darker versions of the green with just a little bit more of the blue mixed in, we're allowing some of the bleeding to happen, but since the surface has been allowed to dry to a certain degree, it's not bleeding all over the place, of course. So you really have to think about how dry the surface is, and the dryness of the surface of the paper is going to affect how the watercolor is going to behave on the surface, obviously. And there are a variety of watercolor techniques. Of course, the most popular techniques are wet onto dry, where you're applying wet watercolor onto a dry surface or onto a dry layer of watercolor paint, and wet into wet, where you're applying wet paint into wet paint, as we can see here with the shadow underneath the tail. Now let's go back to our palette here. I'm going to grab a little bit of yellow ochre, and I'm going to go ahead and put it in its own little section here. We'll go back to the cadmium orange here and add a little bit of that. And we'll go back to the breast of the bird and just intensify this color a little bit. I've allowed this area to dry to a certain degree, so we can apply this color right over the top, and there's not going to be a lot of bleeding that happens. It's going to go right over the top of the colors that we've already applied. Alright, back to the cadmium orange again, this time in another section on our palette. And we're going to go up into that little section just to the right and underneath that green section. This is where we have a really bright, strong red-orange section. So after we've got that orange section basically filled in, while it's still wet, we're going to go back to the cadmium red here and just touch the surface while it's still wet. Allow that color to bleed out. And look how vibrant that is, sitting right next to the green. Then it's back to the wings again making this color a little bit stronger, a little bit more intense, now that we've allowed that section to dry completely. And then it's back to the top of the head here with a deeper version of our yellow-green. This has a little bit of brown mixed into it, a little bit of that burnt umber, just to make a slightly darker value. Now we're going to grab a little bit of cerulean blue here. There are a couple of sections on the bird where we're seeing these really brilliant blues. So I'm going to use a little bit of cerulean blue. I'm going to mix this with just a touch of ultramarine just to tone it down a little bit, and we'll hit those brilliant blue sections. There's one right here on the underside of the tail, and this continues up just underneath the body. Now we're going to mix up a cooler gray, and we're going to use a color called Payne's Gray, which is already a darker, cool gray, but we're going to add a little bit of ultramarine to it just to make it a little bit cooler. We're going to use this color in the shadowed side of the beak here. You can see I'm going right over the top of the pen and ink applications. But I'm going to go ahead and pull this color up just slightly over the middle section of the bill here. And while this area is still a little bit wet, I'm going to add just a touch of yellow ochre. This will add just a little bit more color to the section and make it appear a little bit more natural and less flat. Now we'll use this cooler gray that we've created by combining Payne's Gray and ultramarine down here on the talons. Then it's back to the palette to add a little bit of burnt umber in with our orange mixture here. We're going to use this color primarily for the branch that the bird is sitting on, and I'm allowing this branch to be a little bit more orange than what it is in the reference because that's going to contrast and pop nicely against our blue background, which we'll add in a moment. You can see I'm adding this color mainly with stronger intensity to the lower portion of the branch, leaving open areas for highlights on the top side of the branch. We can go back with a little bit more of the burnt umber in the mixture and just go back over the top of those shadowed areas. So we're creating a slightly darker value on the bottom. Now, while we allow that branch to dry a little bit, we'll go ahead and revisit a couple areas on the bird. We'll make the shadow underneath the bill of the bird a little bit stronger and bring some of that cooler gray around the eye. Now that we've allowed the branch to dry completely, we'll go ahead and add a bit of this cooler gray to some of the shadowed areas in the branch. You're going to see some of the blues pop through, but that's okay. That's going to create the illusion of a more natural looking shadow in areas. Alright, now we're ready to address the areas around the bird, and I'm going to create a background that looks somewhat like the sky. So to do this, I'm taking a larger brush here and I'm just painting the top sections here with a bit of water. We'll address the bottom sections in the same way, but it might be a little bit too difficult to do this in both sections at the same time. So I'm just doing the areas above the branch first and then the areas below. You can see once we've added water to all the areas where we want the blue to show up, we can just dip the brush into the ultramarine here and go straight to the surface and allow the bleeding to happen. Now, while the paint is still wet, we can work the brush around, creating the impression of some clouds and things. It's a good idea to be loose here and have some fun. Don't try to over-control things too much. Then, of course, we're simply going to repeat this process on the lower part of the picture plane here. I've already added water to all the areas where I want the blue to show up, and then I'm just dipping the brush again into the ultramarine with some intensity, and then just touching the surface here and there and allowing the water to pull the color around. Now, of course, I can manipulate the color while this area is still wet, so I can pull the color in the areas that I want, allowing these little lighter shapes and darker shapes to appear, which will give the impression to the viewer that there's sky behind the bird. Now, of course, you can get creative with this. You don't have to use a blue background if you wish. You can use really any color that you wish. Then, of course, once we're happy with the background, our simple and easy line and wash image of a bird is complete. Thanks so much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you were able to pick up a couple of things here and there. If you're new to the channel, or if you haven't done so yet, why not subscribe? We cover a broad variety of drawing and painting media and subject matter here. And make sure that you click on that bell so you're notified whenever we upload a new video. Now, we have a fantastic membership program over at thevirtualinstructor.com. We have a broad variety of drawing and painting courses, weekly live lessons, weekly critiques as part of the Members Minute, and a year-long curriculum for visual arts teachers. If you want to check out our fantastic membership program, there's a link in the description below. Everyone starts out with a week-long trial for free, so you can test out the program and see if it's right for you. If you want to check out 3 of our course videos and ebooks for free, you can do so. There's a link in the description below if you want to check that out as well. As always, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, I wish you the very best in your artistic success.